I'm 60% an American. I'm 60% a man. That's what parity says I am. That's the law of the land. Now do I work 60% of each day, eat 60% of my meals? And does my truck take me into town on 60% of its
Welcome
wheels?
to United Front Radio. That was Pete Seeger's 60% parody song, a protest song written when farm parity price went down from 100% or 90% of parity to 60% of parity price for commodity crops. Last week we had the good fortune to interview Brad Wilson, a working farmer in Iowa and member of the National Family Farm Coalition. Brad is a prolific writer of articles on farm policy, a keeper of charts on ag statistics, and also has a great YouTube channel. To open, we've compiled a 4-minute summary of last week's interview, Part 1. Then we will continue on to the remainder of the interview in Part 2. This is last week's summary of Brad Wilson's interview.
We need standards for fair prices, just as we have a standard for a minimum wage versus not having any standard at all, like having no minimum wage. Unlike the minimum wage, there's also a part of these policies and programs that would have a ceiling over prices so they didn't go too high. The free market was not working for the major farm crops, such as what we would call commodity crops, grains and soybeans and cotton. It was a problem that had gone on for 60 years prior to the Depression, and they'd been fighting on it all through the 20s, and so then they got it passed. Okay, so then they had a price floor. After they got rid of all the price floors in 1996, then we had for corn 8 of the 9 lowest prices in history. And then starting in 1953, they started lowering the price floor down. That's basically the history of it. Until 1996, they ended it. Just 4 corporations own 2/3 of the hogs in the United States. Just 4 corporations. Having a fair price also helps sustainability and conservation. We want livestock to be spread out on the land. It's a system that ties together. Even with having much higher productivity, farmers actually ended up getting paid less. It took 4,000 bushels of wheat to buy a tractor, and then later it took 13,000 bushels. The farm crisis of the 80s continued. One of the things about the parity programs is you don't need any subsidies. One thing that people don't know is that we didn't have any subsidies. It's a big savings. You don't need as many food stamps if you'd raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And it's the same idea here.
This costs nothing to the taxpayer.
Right. The government actually made money on the program. When they lowered the price down by lowering the price floor and then gave back a subsidy, farmers ended up getting less. So even though they got a subsidy, the price had been lowered so much that they got less than what they got before they had any subsidies. The subsidies kind of cover it up, and then farmers get blamed for the subsidy, even though with subsidies, farmers keep getting less and less. If you want to say, oh, the free market works great, and therefore you don't need these programs, yeah, that was true 3 times in the 20th century for a few years each time, but that's like a clock that's broken. It's still right twice a day.
Maybe this is self-evident, but who is against parity? I would have to assume you've got, the grain cartel like Cargill, right, insurance companies, and then commodity futures traders. We've
had surveys of this over the years, and the majority of farmers have supported it. Today, there hasn't been much talk about it. You wonder if the young farmers even know about it. It's been about 20 years since we had a price floor. I actually attended a milk dumping to protest cheap milk prices as they were lowering the price floor on milk back in the 60s. And in the 70s, tractors were camped out in Washington. So farmers have been fighting against this for parity, camping out on the mall in Washington for months. In the 80s, we had all these different groups and coalitions forming. So that whole movement, which was a huge movement, at one time in the 60s, the NFO mobilized 1 million people. The food movement today doesn't really know about this, and most of the public doesn't know about this. It's kind of forgotten. The food movement, they think that the way you can raise prices is take subsidies away from farmers. The food movement misunderstands the issues, so we need to teach them. We have people who, a big crisis of diabetes and people eating too much sugar. And a part of that is let's pay farmers a fair price. How did they cope with the cheap prices? They went out of business. Who survived? It was the person with the better off-farm job. That's who survived. So there are a number of ways that farmers have gotten around this. They keep old machinery. Farmers have not necessarily had health insurance. Farmers have had a relative that inherited the farm and then they're renting it to them extra cheap. So that'd be the farmer that survived when somebody else didn't. It's a long list. of how farmers try to survive with this. If we allow in cheap imports, it can wreck the program. They were talking about, the parity programs as turning back the clock. And I said, take back the clock and not let the clock tell us what to do. We want to run technology, not let technology run us. And we want to run the economy, not let the economy run us. Set a fair price so the United States doesn't lose money for another 25, 30 years. In lowering the price floor down and getting rid of it, that's a trade war. A free trade protects the big corporations. It gives billions and billions of dollars, trillions, to the commodity buyers.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think from what I've seen, it seems like a lot of these other former importers, like Egypt used to import a lot of wheat from the U.S., these countries seem to be trying to protect themselves either with subsidies or some kind of price floor arrangement. I know India just bucked the WTO on this. A lot of these people seem to be trying to get out from being dependent on these cheap U.S. imports and are entering into this whole BRICS system where they are hoping to be exporters to Russia and China and sort of cut the U.S. out. I mean, do you see that as threatening the future of U.S. grain, maybe in a positive way, because we've got nowhere to run with exports, and it's going to create the conditions where something like this could come back?
Yeah.
Now we will continue with the remainder of our interview with Brad Wilson. This is part 2. Thank you for being with us.
Food is really important. Other countries don't want to be dependent upon somebody else. They want to be able to raise as much of their own as they can. Yes. The whole thing that you're talking about is it broke down the whole trade talks, where the agreement on agriculture kept being postponed, and a whole bunch of people were protesting against it. And, a movement grew up to deal with that. One problem with the WTO, under the rules, I guess it's illegal to dump on other countries at a loss. The problem is they use a definition that's a wacko definition. They say, if you think a country's dumping on you, then, you can protest against that country giving their farmers subsidies. If you protest and you get rid of the subsidies, it may be more fair in a way, but it doesn't do anything to raise the price. The WTO, it has a way that's supposed to fix dumping, but it's only by getting rid of subsidies. It doesn't do anything to restore price floors. We need trade agreements to support these policies. Why wouldn't all the agricultural countries of the world want to get paid a fair price? Why would they want to be in a trade war of everybody trying to undersell each other?
Are you aware of any countries that do have a parity standard in place?
I have I've kind of kept track of different places around the world that support price floors. So as we were saying we were going to lower our prices, Europe was saying, we think we should have price floors and fair prices. And that was, during some of these discussions leading to the trade agreements and things. And as we were heading toward the freedom to farm to the end of the parity programs, the total end, about 1990 or so. Over in Africa, they had a big thing with these really cheap prices we were having. They had a report back in about 2006 where they were saying, we need price floors and supply management. There's an international peasant group, La Via Campesina, that has, it's supposed to have, like 200 or 300 million members in all these countries around the world. And they're for the same thing, for price floors and fair prices and supply management. Since prices went higher recently, in recent years, then there's more support you hear about reserve supplies on the top side. So there is a lot of global support. And why wouldn't there be, And the United States did not succeed in increasing its exports, by selling at a loss. We've actually lost ground over the years.
Would you say that I forget who the Secretary of Agriculture was. I read a quote one time about the Ag Secretary under Carter described the United States as a grain colony. Basically, it has nothing to do with U.S. interests, but it's banks using the U.S. and the U.S. farmer as a way to wreck the economies of other nations and as a way to speculate in that.
I forget that guy's name. I should know it under Carter. But anyway, Berglund.
Yeah.
Yeah. We certainly have wrecked them, and we've wrecked our own farming system in the process. Nebraska is a colony. It has had a long periods of losing money on these crops. As I was saying earlier, lower net farm income than we had in the 40s when we had a much lower production, if you adjust for inflation.
For the other people on the call, there's a book called Unforgiven that's, I think, pretty popular as a sort of a handbook to this whole issue.
Yes.
they talk a lot about this subject of the trade turn, where basically, you described that basically we're missing $3.5 trillion in farm income.
Yeah.
And you just think about how would that have recirculated in terms of people buying new tractors or buying, hiring labor, building these rural economies.
Right.
What's the loss to America for not having this money go into the pocket of farmers?
Yes. So you're talking about the wealth creation, the economic multipliers that multiply the money, and agriculture is a great place to multiply wealth. What they were saying back then was, it'll multiply 7 times, and that's higher than other aspects of the economy. Multiply 7 times, and people might argue about that, but they still do agree that it's a good way to create wealth, and that's especially true in the poor countries of the world. The poor countries of the world are primarily farming countries. The least developed countries are 70% rural. When they talk about the undernourished, they are 80% rural. So, yeah, it's caused hunger. The cheap prices are what have caused hunger because they've caused the poverty. I call it food poverty, the food poverty crisis. And then we have a few years of higher prices, and because they've had, such deep poverty, then they can't handle that either, even though they're farming countries and they need higher prices. So it's a dilemma.
Would you have to ease this in, even in the United States, over a period of years so that you're not having, big price spikes by just ramping it right up to 100%? Or
they probably would. First thing, in my mind, first thing is there's a lot of things we can discuss after we kind of get people to know that the issue exists.
Right.
So anyway, it's great that you guys are bringing it out here.
James, do you have any...
Sorry.
Go ahead.
James just had to go to a meeting right this second, but you can ask me what we're experiencing on the ground here. Yeah, nobody knows what parity is, especially not the average Californian. When I was petitioning out in Nebraska, I only found that it was the older farmers in their 70s who remembered it, but none of the younger farmers knew what it was.
One thing that the urban people know, though, is the words cheap food, okay? Even though farming is not just food, the cheap prices. There is a lot of knowledge. The food movement has done a lot of good in actually teaching people about cheap food, that cheap food is bad, in different ways, and that farmers should be paid more.
Right.
It's just getting them to know what the policies are that really do that, instead of what the policies are that people think mistakenly.
So what do you say when people say, wouldn't parity raise our food prices?
Well, one of the things I say is, as you've been eating over the last 25 and 30 years, if you've eaten a wheat product over the past 30 years, or if you've eaten a dairy product over the past 21 years, then every time you've eaten it, farmers have subsidized you. And even though subsidies were paid to farmers, the net result is farmers subsidized you. They subsidize you often below the cost of production, and they also subsidize you below a fair price, a minimum wage kind of price, and they also subsidize you below a living wage price. Okay, and when we go, and also I would say when we have gone into the inner city to talk to the poor people, as we have done to different groups of us at times, we tell them, we support raising the minimum wage, and it's the same idea. We don't say, oh my gosh, if you raise the minimum wage, all our costs are going to go up. We say you have to give them a fair price. They shouldn't be subsidizing us, so that's another way that I talk about it. Here's the thing, okay? It saves $100 billion almost in the farm bill over a number of years. So there's more than enough money, to give more money to help feed hungry people. In some of the videos, I have a video on consumers, and in my list on there, it has consumers on it. It's got Dixon Terry on it. It's a slideshow, or no, it's an interview. But anyway, and it talks about this issue. So in the farm bills that we farmers have supported, we have supported more money for food stamps to go along with this all the way, and we still had a cheaper cost for the government in our proposals. So we've given enough money into there to do that. Another thing I talk to people about is, why is it that farmers are the only ones that are supporting a price ceiling to protect the poor in our cities from food prices going too high? Because we do. We have price ceiling and reserve supplies in our proposals to help people. So it's a balanced approach.
We're in a bit of a bubble out here. We're in a different environment, especially different than I was in Nebraska. You have a big class divide between let's call them yuppies, or the food movement people, and then the inner cities. And amongst the food movement people, they don't want to see any subsidies going to Monsanto and these companies that they say make GMO foods or are not organic. And there's a lot of infighting amongst who should get subsidized. And they say that any of the things that are traded on the commodities exchange they're either GMO or it's factory farming. So we get that kind of thing out in California. It's very reactionary.
Yes. And one of the things that I say then is that it's not enough to give small amounts of subsidy money that you'll be able to win in the Farm Bill to sustainable and organic farmers. That's not enough. Mm-hmm. What you should support is something that will help make all farms become more sustainable, that will help make it possible for more farms to become organic. You should support that. Right. So that's a big thing that you can do for sustainability that's a lot bigger than what the food movement is supporting. And how do you do that? Well, one of the first things you want to do is you want to pay farmers fair prices so that they can get their livestock back and they can plant and they can have crop rotations, okay? Mm-hmm. Because if they have no livestock, and they don't have a use for their alfalfa and clover, then it's really hard to have a decent crop rotation. So if you're going to, and they're not going to have any livestock because the CAFO's got all the livestock because the Farm Bill has given the CAFOs a competitive advantage. So therefore, my feeling is it's okay to give some subsidies for sustainability and various things, but one of the things you want to do is where are you going to get the money? We have the proposal that'll give you the money. That's one thing. And then we have a proposal that also uses the market to do good. So we're going to help end poverty and hunger all over the entire world by not dumping, by having fair prices. We're going to do that not by charging money, but by simply managing the market. We're going to accomplish good for sustainability to help crop rotations by managing the market, not by writing checks. So we're going to free up money that could be used for all these good purposes. At the same time, we're going to accomplish even more good by managing the market. And by the way, we also support raising the minimum wage to a living wage, is what I say, to reduce the need for food stamps and other kinds of welfare, and that will free up more money, too, to help feed the hungry.
Brad, I'm trying to anticipate some questions that I'm going to get, and I think the questions are going to come in the form of questions about the beef industry, questions about trade, and questions about the Farm Bill. Can you help me anticipate any questions, what questions they might be asking me?
Yes. I've been thinking about that. Well, they're concerned about the EPA asking farmers to do too much.
Yeah, sure.
One thing I say is you shouldn't just keep asking farmers. There is more farmers should do, I believe, but you want to pay farmers first, and then you can ask them to do more, instead of just coming through with a regulation but not paying farmers anymore. The parity program is a way to say we believe farmers should be paid more. And then, then you can talk about how much do you want farmers to do. You say, okay, you want them to do a whole lot of stuff? Well, and then, maybe the parity price level looks a lot better then. So you don't just want them to have a minimum wage price. You want them to have a living wage price. That's some of how I would talk about it.
That's great. And what do you think the trade question will be?
Well, we have there's some trade agreements that are being discussed right now, and they're keeping it secret.
Sure.
All these trade agreements have been to try to, what they promise to farmers is that we'll give you more market access so that you can sell into these other countries. The problem is that what they end up doing is that they drive down global prices by being able to drive down prices everywhere and to play one country off against another more easily by having all of them have cheap prices. The big corporations, what good is market access if the price is so cheap? This guy, Darrell Ray, he has these columns. He's got 700-some columns. And I've been looking at them for, which columns talk about these issues. It's a little much to try to figure out before Monday, but, I do have them categorized where I can find certain ones on certain topics. There's a number of things on exports. Basically, exports, it was promised that if farmers would have cheap prices here, that then, in the long run, we'd run all these other farmers out of business, and we would... that was the basic idea of it. One question for trade: who's the enemy?
What do you mean?
Are we really against farmers in general making some money, or are we against people not being willing to pay us a fair price? We should be joining together. If you look at OPEC joined together. They balance supply and demand, and they raise their prices. I've got a chart showing, how you can compare this to wheat or to corn. In 1946, wheat was higher than oil. Wheat per bushel was higher than oil per barrel. 1947 was the record high corn year. The price of a bushel of corn was the same exactly as the price of a bushel of wheat. I'm sorry, as the price of a barrel of oil. Corn and oil were the same in that sense. So then what OPEC did was that they eventually decided we're going to get paid more. We think it makes sense to make a profit. So they balanced supply and demand, and they raised their prices up. If you look at corn today, $3.50, and is oil $3.50 a barrel? No, it's like, I think last year was 2013 was like $90 a barrel. We lowered our prices of exports, and we had a bigger market share than OPEC. Our export market share, for corn, we used to have 70% market share. At one point we had 90% export market share for soybeans. So then South America and Europe and everybody could divide up the other 10% of exports. But anyway, so we chose to lose money on our exports, even though we were bigger than OPEC, and we could have cut back in supply and charged whatever we wanted. That's my main argument on that.
Brad, I really appreciate your time. I do have one more question. What do you think the question about the Farm Bill might be?
Well, it would be good to know something about these insurance programs. One of the things about the insurance programs is that they started them in the 2008 Farm Bill to a certain extent, maybe somewhat earlier, but anyway, and they called it revenue insurance. In other words, you're not going to just get insured for having a crop failure. You're going to get insured for having cheap prices. Farmers had a choice. They could do a more traditional program, or they could do the revenue insurance program after the 2008 Farm Bill. Less than 10% of the farmers chose to do revenue insurance. They didn't want that approach. Farmers rejected it, and it would pay you more if prices were high, probably, but if we had a crash like the Depression, it would pay you less. So the other choice was a combination of counter-cyclical subsidies and then these direct subsidies that you get whether you need them or not. In the Great Depression, when my family went to the elevator, they asked what was the price of corn, and they said, I don't know, nobody's selling. We'll look it up. And they looked it up, and they said 7 cents a bushel. Okay, no price floor. That was before price floors. So they fixed that with price floors, and they did a good job of that. Here's another thing from the Depression. Farmers, as individuals, they didn't have the ability to manage the supply because they're so small and spread out. But the big corporations in the farm implement dealer, they cut back on supply by, 60 or 80%. And then they didn't have to lower their prices. The same thing for, it was both farm implement and also, I think, automobile manufacturers. Farm production was cut by only 7%, and then the prices crashed way down in the Depression. So, and we don't have any protection against that in any of these farm bills these days. And the insurance programs don't protect it. So the farm bill is getting worse for farmers. Should we have a crash at low prices? And at the same time, here's one other thing I want to mention. There's a group, the Environmental Working Group, they have the Farm Subsidy Database. They have a collection of editorials. They collected 600 or 700 editorials about the Farm Bill. And one of the things these editorials say is that they bash farmers. There's a lot of criticism of farmers because farmers get subsidies, and they don't know that farmers have had reductions before the subsidies. So the idea of getting subsidies instead of a fair price has been terrible public relations for farmers. People in Iowa and probably Nebraska don't know very well about how much criticism there is of farmers, such as Midwestern farmers and such as Iowa farmers. So I was in a conference in New York City, and they were criticizing Iowa farmers. And I was in a conference in San Francisco, in Oakland actually, and they were saying the same thing. So this whole system that they have is making it harder and harder for the general public to support farmers and to support agriculture. We've never had this much criticism. So that's part of what the Farm Bill is doing for farmers, because it doesn't give us a fair price where we have a program that pays for itself like we used to have.
Would you suspect that under a parity system that people would, you sort of alluded to this before where, with organics, that just a fair price allows people to grow organically, but if you're looking at like the GMO issue or just, the abundance of cheap corn and all that, would most farmers prefer to be growing sustainably if they had the price to do it? Do you think that the parity price alone would tend to diminish the role of GMOs or would sort of change the composition of farms pretty naturally just because that's what people would rather be doing anyway?
One of the of the things with GMOs is it's a concentration of power. You were talking about the economics, asking about the economics. It's a concentration of power in the hands of a few. Monsanto was licensing out their Roundup Ready stuff to some other corporation. But they had like 80% control. 80% of the stuff had their genes in it. So it's a concentration of power that's certainly a bad thing for farmers. I'm hearing other bad things about GMOs, like they destroy the ability of the soil of the glyphosate, the herbicide that goes with it, that it destroys the ability of the soil to hold on to nutrients. So the ability of the soil to hold on to fertility goes down. Well, I haven't seen enough on that to say much about it. And then there's something else about it hurting livestock. There are different things coming out about it. I suspect we'll be hearing more about one was that having to do with the ability to have, livestock births. A parity price also helps local food and organic farming because they get a premium on top of the conventional price. So if the conventional price is the lowest in history, they don't get much money because their premium is on top of the lowest price in history. So that's the way that this supports a lot of these others. It supports sustainable agriculture. Anybody who can get a premium price, what are you going to get it on top? We had a guy here race with a cheese group, and he had the best cheese I've ever eaten. And he finally said, "Well, it's just too much work." He didn't say we weren't making enough money. He said it was too much work. So I said, "Well, if you were paid twice as much, which I think your stuff is worth, you wouldn't have to work so hard."
Are these monocrops like you have out in a place like Nebraska, when you have 1,000-acre plus farms, even able to grow organically? Is it even possible to have them be organic?
It takes several years to become organic. You have to be without chemicals for at least 3 years. You have to have a crop rotation. I think you have to have a crop rotation to make it work.
Right.
You have to have a way to get your fertility if you can't get it from the old methods. So therefore, you can actually get enough nitrogen. That's the main thing you need, to grow corn. Mm-hmm. It's one of the big things you need to grow corn. And you actually get enough from the new varieties of alfalfa and clover to grow, great corn crop.
Okay.
I know an organic farmer was getting 180 bushels to the acre, but it was something that was more sustainable, a form of nitrogen, because it came and then it comes out of the air into through bacteria and into the legume crops. And alfalfa and clover are a lot better at getting that nitrogen than crops like soybeans. One of the big things about this whole organic thing is just when you can come back and have the ability to have a crop rotation because you've got your livestock and you have a decent price for your oats and barley and rye, you save money. One of the big things for farmers is to help them get a crop rotation back and not say, hey, wouldn't it be great to be organic, but say, wouldn't it be great to save money and not be dependent upon these companies that keep jacking up the prices of your inputs all the time. So to be more free from the input complex, that's one thing I would say about sustainability to farmers in general, such as in Nebraska is, we want to help farmers lower their costs by helping them get their livestock back, making, if you have livestock on your farm, you can feed them out at your cost of production, and that's lower than the market price. It's not higher than the market price. I hope it's all helpful here, and you can email, anybody can email me.
This is very helpful and very interesting, and stuff that people don't know about and talk about, and I think it's really important.
That one video of mine you should see. I recommend it. It's actually about 19 minutes. I was going to make a series of 10 videos that are much shorter that tell the same story. But anyway, that one video, and I'll send a link for it, will show pictures of a lot of things. And we need the livestock on the land, spread out.
Thank you again, Brad, for all your time. This has been really great. I hope we can stay in touch and maybe do it again sometime.
You bet. And it helps me,
Brad.
too, yeah.
And you've already given all this information in the last hour and a half that you've talked to us. But if you were in James's situation right now, canvassing, campaigning, bringing this issue up in forums or in speeches, what would you want James to say to California?
Oh, to California?
Yeah, and Californians, which will be either the slow food movement people or inner city desperately poor people. So that's the demographic here, like I said.
Well, it's not just the food movement, but also the mainstream media has all over the country, in these editorials I was talking about, they have talked a lot about this food movement issues. This is all better than what the food movement is doing for some of their own goals. So there's a way of talking about this to say this is good for public health because this raises the price of sugar. This is good for, the fact that you don't have all these antibiotics going into your meat because it's helping to bring livestock back out onto the land in more sustainable systems.
Mm-hmm.
So you can talk about all these kinds of progressive issues, for example, and just issues that, and then, the issue of export dumping on other countries, and say, and then if you want to talk to conservatives, I mean, these are great things to bring up with conservatives. Say, do you believe in subsidizing foreign countries by selling our farm things at a loss?
Right.
We're the dominant exporter. We're the biggest exporter. Why should we be losing money on our exports?
Mm-hmm.
Aren't you for profit? What do you think we should charge? What do you think we should charge China if they want to buy our stuff? Should we charge parity, or do you want to charge below the cost of production?
Mm-hmm.
By the way, our farm bill, we get rid of all the farm subsidies, and we're going to make a profit on our exports. So we're saving, we're balancing the budget, we're creating wealth, and we're putting livestock into the kinds of systems that create more wealth and create more jobs.
I think the big breakthrough for parity is going to come, like you said, with the fight for 15. Once we get a higher minimum wage, it's going to be a no-brainer. Farmers are going to have a fair price, too.
Hey, that's what we're talking about. We think there should be a living wage price for farmers instead of giving cheap prices to junk food makers and et cetera.
Right. So a living wage across the board.
Yeah. I think the word living wage is a good one to use along with this, in that they understand that better. And anytime there's a living wage campaign, there's going to be people on, opportunities to talk about it.
Yeah.
Our parity program is more fiscally conservative,
Right.
in the sense that we have a less expensive farm bill. We're going to free up this $95 billion, $96, $97 billion for other uses, including balancing the budget. And at the same time, we're going to make a profit on exports. Why would we, if we're the dominant exporter, why would we want to lose money? Do you want to subsidize China?
Right.
Do you want to subsidize the Middle East? Who do you want to subsidize in foreign countries? If you're talking to conservatives, who do they hate? What foreigners do they hate? We're changing to a system that creates more wealth and more jobs. This is an economic stimulus, but we're not asking, it's not a stimulus. And by the way, this is something I guess I didn't mention. They had in the 1940s the Stegall Amendment, and that was, saying we're going to use the Farm Bill as an economic stimulus. That's why they went to the parity level in the 1942 to 52, was as an economic stimulus. But it's not a government spending stimulus that's going to cost everybody more taxes. It's a market stimulus with the farm price, and we're going to create wealth that way. It's going to balance supply and demand so we don't overproduce. We shouldn't overproduce and lose money, put on a bunch of chemicals and everything. Why would we use up all these resources just to lose money? We'll also be protecting, again, top side and bottom side. There's these studies. I've used a visual aid. There's a document on the internet. It has 56 studies finding out that big corporate farms create less wealth, and they're bad for society and they're bad for the environment. I emphasize the wealth creation part of it. So I take that as a handout. Here's the list of the 56 studies that say that this other way creates less wealth. When you go for just the 4 corporations that own all the hogs, you're creating a lot less wealth. Here's 56 studies that say so. And then there's this John Eichert from Missouri. He has a thing. He says, for every hog factory job created, we lose 2 independent farmers. So you lose 2 better jobs for every. So you have a net reduction, creating fewer jobs that way.
So parity can stop that concentration of livestock due to the crop rotation.
They got to pay higher prices for feed. And then you have the advantage of having livestock on all of the farms.
There's a giant anti-factory farming movement. We have to meet with a few of the animal rights groups. I'm happy to have that information.
Yeah, it's a more humane way to have the livestock spread out on the land and not all crammed together in these bad conditions.
They wrote to me, one of the questions is, what would you do about factory farming? This helps me answer that.
Yeah, yes. Make them pay. And make them pay instead of subsidies. That's another way that some people say it. Make the big corporations pay instead of subsidies.
Right.
And I've got a lot of stuff online, and I'll give you a few hints to some of the ways to get started with it.
Also, Brad has a YouTube channel where he's organized a lot of his videos.
Yeah, I have several places. I've started a thing on SlideShare too, where I now have 2 slideshows up.
Hi.
This has been very helpful,
thanks
Brad.
again.
Thank you so much. This has been
You bet.
great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brad. Have a nice evening.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
We just finished listening to a great call with Brad Wilson about parity agriculture and just sort of about the history of ag issues, Brad sent me a video from his YouTube channel, which is Fireweed Farm.
Is that the name of his YouTube channel, Fireweed Farm?
Fireweed Farm.
Go and check that YouTube channel out because it's got tons of content.
Yeah, he's got a lot of great stuff that's maybe a little bit heavy on data and charts, a lot of which he mentioned in our discussion. Got some really good ones. He does a rebuttal to Michael Pollan. The one that I was about to talk about, though, was called the Food Movement 1985. Were you there, or something like that?
Were you there? We were.
Yeah, right. And it shows he was actually jumped up in the audience on the Phil Donahue show to talk about parity. And this was in 1985. You know, he mentioned that parity support was finally killed off entirely in what was it, 92 or 3?
96.
96. But in 85, it just seemed like another time and place. Like, that's not that long ago. But there was an audience of probably 10,000 people at this live taping of Phil Donahue, and they had, like, Tom Harkin and some other people up on the stage, and then just this mob of irate farmers in Iowa just screaming about, we need a fair price. A lady stood up and said something to the effect of, I don't want your goddamn subsidies, and I just want a fair price for my farm.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty interesting to see how not that long ago that was still, there was something like an agriculture movement in this country.
The idea of subsidies became so much clearer to me after learning about this, because I always thought subsidies were something that was necessary and the government was doing because there was no other choice.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that this is the government being held hostage by Wall Street.
Right.
Meaning Wall Street says you have to give charity or subsidize these farmers so that we can extract more.
Yep.
Just like the bailouts. That's the government filling in the cracks where Wall Street needs welfare.
Right. And, like he said, the subsidy, what was it, for every $1 in subsidy, there's $3 in lost income.
And that's going to Wall Street.
Yeah. It's not a bailout of the farmers or a subsidy of the farmers. It's a subsidy of Cargill, commodity futures markets in Chicago. There's a book called Merchants of Grain by a guy named Dan Morgan. Not very many people have written about them because they're a privately owned company. So a lot of what they do has not been subjected to scrutiny. The best things that I've read about them, there's a chapter in Ralph Nader had this book called The Big Boys, where he sort of just goes through a list of companies to show how different industries work. That's actually a very interesting book.
The subsidy goes to Cargill?
Well, it goes to the farmer, but just saying it allows that price to be cheap so that Cargill's got a lot of wiggle room where they can go up and down. Cargill is one of the big merchants. Like, they buy from grain elevators and stuff, and they have some of the biggest flour milling operations. Brad talked about this thing called the Great Russian Grain Robbery.
Uh-huh.
And it was basically that Henry Kissinger arranged this whole thing in like 1978. They didn't tell anybody what they were about to do, but they let the grain prices sink way down. Then all of a sudden they sold off like 100% of the U.S. grain surplus to Russia at this cut rate price. Farmers didn't get anything for their price, but then the next day the price of grain just shot through the roof because you had this very sharp contraction of supply. All of the grain traders, were going long on grain when the price was not so good and just made a killing. Mm-hmm. And it was basically a collusion between Kissinger and the Ford White House. In this Merchants of Grain book, it focuses mostly on Cargill. The grain merchants or the grain cartel is probably 5 or 6 companies. It's Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, which is actually related to Julia Louis Dreyfus from Seinfeld, Bunge, a couple in Europe, maybe like one in Asia and a couple in the U.S., but Cargill's by far the biggest. It's the biggest privately owned company, if not in the world, definitely in America. The way they make money is not by the price of grain rising, it's by them knowing what the price of grain is going to be in the future. Basically by like having all of that data, they know what's going on out there in the fields. They know who's going to be buying what in the future. They basically like have a monopoly on data and on the analysis. They basically own a bunch of front companies in the Caribbean and in Europe and everywhere else, so they're just flash trading grain futures. And this stuff is all centered in Chicago and Minneapolis, but Cargill is a big part of how this whole thing works. And it's basically just like, keep the price low so you've got a big cushion. You make the market, know exactly what's going to happen, and you're making all the right bets and you never lose. And as the price goes up and down, you're always ahead of the curve. And so basically Cargill they don't make money on grain so much because the grain is so damn cheap, but they just make an absolute obscene amount of money on this market making stuff.
Oh my God. Should we be able to trade commodities?
Throughout the 40s, the commodity futures markets closed. Just out of business, nothing to do. They didn't have a product to trade. I'm sure you could find some examples of futures that were necessary. Like, there's some use for hedging. Like, if you're an exporter and you need to trade in a foreign currency because you're exporting to China or whatever, so you're going to be paid in renminbi or something like that. It's valuable and necessary to like hedge against the value of that currency at the date you're going to export. It's basically like an insurance policy that they're not going to dump the value of their currency relative to the dollar. You know, there's stuff like that that makes sense, but it doesn't make any sense for Cargill to be betting on the future price of somebody else's grain. What does that have to do with them, you know?
So the best way to solve this is put in a parity price, not just end commodity speculation.
Yeah.
Because if there's a parity price, then they wouldn't be able to do exactly what you were talking about.
If you talk to somebody from the Farm Bureau about commodity futures, they would say, well, it's absolutely necessary because it's insurance. It allows the farmer to insure his own crop and say, okay, I'm going to lock in the price at X. But it's like insurance for an earthquake that Cargill creates. You're basically buying protection money from the mafia. You're paying some insurance policy for them to not break your windows or something kind of like that.
Every one of our metaphors on this show and every episode comes down to organized corporations or Wall Street. It's like you're dealing with the mafia.
Yeah. You need public alternatives to the free market or to Wall Street. You can't just... It's not enough to just say commodity futures markets hurt farmers, so let's shut them down. Because then there's nothing to replace it. It's kind of the same as saying, like, interest rates are too high on home mortgages, so let's shut down the banks. Or let's nationalize the banks or whatever. It doesn't tell you what you're supposed to do to replace the thing that's needed, which is somebody to finance your home mortgage. Rather than just trying to kill the problem, you've got to put the alternative in place, and then the problem dies because there's no oxygen for it.
Like if you put a price floor or a price ceiling on a mortgage.
Right.
Adjustable rate mortgages can't fly all over the place.
And you could do the same thing. The National Bank could step in and say, okay, we're going to do... I mean, imagine if they just came in and said, we're going to offer 1% fixed rate mortgages for everybody. Then the worst thing that can happen is that whoever, your local bank or credit union is going to have to come in and say, okay, well, we're going to offer a mortgage at 1.25%, and we're going to borrow the money from the Fed to relend to you and basically service the loan. Right. It's kind of the same thing where the government doesn't have to actually run the whole bureaucracy. They just have to threaten the market with a better deal.
That's the same as us saying that state, community, city colleges should be free. If we made those free, then the private institutions would have to compete with that price, and their prices would have to come down.
Right. We've talked in the past about even just gardening, can backyard gardens feed the world? There was the whole, the after party, which was like this most recent Occupy anarchist movement, and that was their big thing. They're going to come into Detroit and build urban gardens or backyard gardens. Or I don't know if you've seen these people that literally say the U.S. needs to look to Cuba, where people grow cilantro on their roof, and that's how we're going to feed the world.
This is something we should unravel. Let's figure this out. Let's try to get to the core of this issue. I mean, that can be done with produce, herbs, and I know people who have backyard gardens that can go around giving some of their produce to the neighbors and do grow too much for themselves with their backyard gardens, but they're not growing wheat. A human needs a certain amount of calories to survive. If you were going to live just on a home garden, like when I was out in California, James Hinton, who's running for Congress, has his own organic garden in the backyard. And he has more cucumbers and more zucchini and more tomatoes than any one person would know what to do with.
Right.
But there's only so many cucumbers you can eat. Could he grow all the ingredients to make a burrito?
We have so many zucchini that we've been eating a ton. We froze more than we're going to use this year, and we still have zucchini that look like wiffle ball bats, just like flying out of the ground every day, and we're just throwing them into our compost pile. You know, I don't know what's the human calorie intake. 2,000 calories a day. Like, if you were to eat nothing but potatoes, you can actually survive on potatoes alone if you eat some extra vitamin C on top of that. You could survive on, let's say, like 3 or 4 large potatoes per meal per day. You know, so maybe eat like 9 or 10 potatoes a day. Not too long ago, just pulled out our potatoes, and it was like I think about a 12 by 3 foot little plot in our garden, and I probably had 40 potatoes in there. So that's 4 days worth of potatoes out of a summer's worth of gardening. You know, like you're saying, backyard gardening is great for whatever.
Supplementing. Humans need diversity and can't exist on produce alone.
Right.
I have never met anybody who exists completely off of their own, off of what they grow alone. And I had my own farm for 4 years. I grew vegetables and fruit. I would have to go out and supplement that with rice and grains.
Right.
By buying that at the Costco or wherever I bought it. I didn't meet anybody in that farming community who had even a large farm that existed independently.
Yeah, I think with the figures that I've read, I'm really into this kind of stuff for like homesteading, is that you would need is maybe 1/4 of an acre per person could grow all of your caloric needs, and that would be like, you know, potatoes, oatmeal, corn, beans, and then having like chickens and eggs and stuff running around. So for a family of 4, a full acre, not including your house, like that's a pretty big piece of land, just completely covered in fields of edible products. So like it's not, there's no backyard garden that comes anywhere close to that. And
you're saying that's every person doing that.
Yeah.
And this is a regressive thing. You know, we hopefully as human beings want to be a progressive, and the idea that we can get our food and not have to make it ourselves means that we have free time to do other things. There are people that are not fit to do that kind of work, and there are people who don't want to do that work. Honestly, when I had my farm for 4 years, I couldn't wait to get the hell out of there. I was done.
Yeah.
I know that sounds horrible, but I listen to people, they talk about it like it's this idyllic life that everybody should want to go and farm. It's a full-time job. I was longing to do something else.
Yeah, I think people have this very romantic notion about it just because of what they see on TV, or maybe they go to the farmer's market or whatever, but we have a fairly big family garden. It's maybe like 20 by 40 feet of garden space, and then like fruit trees and berries and stuff like that. But even that's enough for, like, we don't buy much produce during the summer, and it gets us some snacks, you know? That's about it. It really just makes you appreciate sort of how important it is to have a stable food supply, and to have these people who are out there where one farmer is able to support 100 families rather than everybody living like the Amish or something, where you just support yourself and then you make, you whittle some.
Well, look at an Amish community, and I don't want to sound rude or anything, but that's all they do.
Yeah.
They're not encouraging their kids to become engineers or great scientists or get out of there or just to spend all day thinking. Or what are the great novels that have come out of the Amish community? I don't mean to be horrible, but I'm saying they teach you from an early age to do carpentry and farming and subsistence living. I mean,
I'm sure it's kind of a neat life in some ways, but I don't know. Having read some books about the Amish and having heard from other people, and it's not like a horrible life, but it's like those people literally, they typically pull their teeth out at about age 20 or 25 because they can't afford to fill cavities. Mm-hmm. There is, this might be a little over the top, but there's bestiality problems in the community. It's a backwards, low technology, low education lifestyle. People think about this halcyon past. It's the whole noble savage thing, even where wouldn't it have been great to be a Native American living off the land and being in peace with nature. It's like, yeah, except there's no air conditioning. You're sweating and dirty and smelly all the time. And maybe you starve to death.
The goal of human beings should be to have as much choice as possible. Everything's idyllic when you're visiting.
Right.
But if you are Amish and you don't have a choice, you know, in a tribe in the Amazon, and you don't have a choice, all of those people, if you spoke to them, would love to be able to have a choice to get out or to experience other things. We should be working toward each human being having choice. If somebody wants to spend their life being a farmer, then they should be allowed to do that. But it shouldn't be that anybody has to. That's going backwards. The goal should be that each human being has the opportunity to do whatever they want to do, whatever their imagination takes them. Even in third world countries, we should be working toward that.
Yeah, and like a family farm should not be a guy with a hoe and a pitchfork out toiling in the fields all day. Like, you know, that's the point of the fair price, is just to sort of average out what does it cost to produce this stuff. And then every year that changes a little bit as technology makes things more efficient. The price goes down and the support rate goes down. You want there to be enough support where people can choose, this is the right amount of acreage to be growing corn at. This is the right way to do it in terms of, I'm going to take, you know, some land out of production every year to grow cover crops and to put some animals on it, or what. You need farmers to be agricultural technologists, you know, where they're studying and improving their methods, and basically they're supported at the rate that they need to improve their efficiency every year, as opposed to they have to do anything they can to meet just this arbitrary target that's set by the grain cartel, which is just a bunch of super rich parasites, you know, snorting money up their nose and hiding it in Swiss bank accounts.
And if all these Occupy groups stuck to the named enemy, you know, whatever Wall Street is, and they understood parity, that's what they should be pushing. The answer to everything is this regressive, well, if we all just go back to the land. Well, what if we all don't want to go back to the land?
Yeah.
You can't have indigenous rights without opportunity.
Yeah.
They have one of their main things is indigenous rights. Well, what does that mean? All the indigenous people that I've ever met want is opportunity. They want the same opportunities that that an educated white person in America has.
Right. I mean, so there's that side of it, which is just people are like enforcing arbitrary cultural values onto the people who are responsible for growing the food, you know. And then on the other hand, an arbitrary price or economy is being forced upon them. You just need to break it down to say people need food to live. Therefore, we need farmers. What does it cost these farmers to do things in the way that they need to do them? And I think we can trust farmers a lot more than we can trust Derek Jensen or some wacko anthropologist or something to
who wants to end civilization.
Yeah. You know, and I think people would find that it's not going to be robotic tractors and, you know, everything's grown with ammonium and blah, blah, blah. It's like where it's probably going to go is highly efficient sheet composting and brewing microbial teas in your barn facility, and you know what I mean? Like there are...
No.
Just meaning that, like, organic methods doesn't just mean a pig taking a shit on your land. I
see what you're saying.
You know,
yeah,
it means like increasing microbial life in the soil so that plants are more resilient and higher in nutrients and stuff. But there are ways to do that are also going to require new technologies and new methods and whatever, and that's going to grow a new part of the economy. That stuff is not taking off because it's too expensive to do.
People like David Graeber and Derek Jensen have this weird mix of ending civilization, all the material stuff, and then also simultaneously going into some sort of high-tech.
Yeah.
You know, going high-tech on one end and then ending civilization. So it's kind of like this idea that we're all going to be living on a computer with Soylent Green kind of pumped into our veins.
You have experience just with, like, the futurist people. I mean, how does that all...
What their ideal would be is that we all merge with machines to increase our mental efficiency and physical efficiency. Like, you know, we don't age as fast. We cure diseases through nanobots that eat cancer and all this kind of stuff. We merge with machines, essentially. and then were able to live off of non-food. One of the things this guy was developing, who was in the group when I was there, was seriously, it was called Soylent.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a shake that tasted like raw oatmeal,
mm-hmm.
and you would live 100% on that. And he had was proving, I think he had lived on it for many months.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was really a disgusting operation, actually. It was in Silicon Valley, and he was making this Soylent concoction from bulk vitamins and bulk oats thing he had bought on the internet, and he was mixing it in a Home Depot orange you know those paint 5-gallon containers from the Home Depot? He was mixing it in that and then packaging it. They were all talking about, raving about what a great startup company this is. And a lot of the Soylent that was sent out was covered in mold, and people were getting sick because it was infected with bacteria.
Well, and there you go. It's somebody already invented instant freaking oatmeal, and like I know people. Like I have one of my I have some friends that run one of the biggest sausage manufacturing operations in the country. Mm-hmm. These guys are all PhD food scientists, geniuses.
Exactly.
Even this idea of like, we're going to make, homemade sausage in our garages and stuff. Good luck with your botulism, because they're...
Well, that's what happened. This guy was a tech guy. Right. He had no food experience. All he did was do some food research on the internet and made this Soylent. Never said, "Oh, isn't that cute? It's called Soylent." What I was really trying to explain to you was that this is the mindset.
Right.
The reason that company got many millions of dollars of startup money from these Silicon Valley guys is because he called it Soylent. It was good branding, because that's the mindset. The mindset is how can we live? Well, they would be happy to live on air. Exactly, Brave New World. I mean, that is not a dystopic idea for them. Mm-hmm. They want to stay 35 years young, die when they choose to by injection, and increase their mental capacity through stimulants, various stimulants. My argument with all this stuff was they kept going further and further, like with the Google eyeglasses and all this kind of stuff. I was just wondering if the human body could take it, or if it was going to cause sickness. We still don't even know what the effects of cell phone radiation is.
Right.
We're not 20 years down the line when everybody's coming out with tumors. I don't know what the effect of is sitting in front of your laptop strapped in and with Google eyeglasses on and all this kind of stuff is going to be on society and the human body, like that movie that we watched, Her. That's what the futurists are into. That's their thing. I mean, that's their meal ticket. They're into how we can move into the future in that way. But they have no concept of the material, concrete world.
You told me about, I picked up this documentary from the library and haven't watched it yet, the Life 2.0, about the people who get into, what is it, Second Life?
Yeah, the Second Life people. Oh, you haven't watched that yet?
No.
Oh, it's really creepy. People living via their computers.
Right.
Well, that's what the futurists believe. We're going to live via our computers, and basically, how can we just keep our human bodies, which is, the human body is a relic to them, how can we just keep that alive? You saw that in the Matrix movie. Remember they ate that weird oatmeal stuff?
Yeah.
That's what it is. Anything to do with industry or farming, they'll just shirk and just go, ugh, does it pollute? Ugh, is it organic? Like, it's just this...
Yeah.
It's this idea that anybody who produces something is some sort of cretin.
It just makes me wonder, is there a controlling power behind the future, behind a Ray Kurzweil or whatever, these people that are like, we're just going for the singularity and we're going to be nano cyborgs and... pushing that agenda, because it takes people out of political life, it takes them out of the economy, it removes any threat of a resurgent industrial class or industrial or agricultural movement in the country.
The world elite go to future meetings.
But then why does Queen why does Queen Elizabeth pose outside of Balmoral Castle on the mossy steppes of Scotland? Why does Ted Turner have a 5 zillion acre ranch in the desert where he just wants to enjoy nature? Like, these people...
The elite of the world visited these future society meetings. They're very expensive to go to. Mm-hmm. They show off what the new futuristic gadgets are. This is a way for people to invest, stay at the cutting edge of what's available. Mm-hmm. They're interested in life extension technology for themselves. And there's nothing out there in the universe. Like, the Queen of England doesn't possess anything more secret than the future society, which was interesting to me. I always thought that the Queen of England was hiding this secret knowledge that only she knew about, and she was really 500 years old. But she was sending a representative to visit the future meetings to see if she could live any longer.
Wow. The Queen of England can't reimagine the agricultural economy because they can't do anything. The Queen of England, hires a guy to wipe her butt.
We're going to have to continue this talk on the future, Kyle, because we're out of time. You've been listening to UCY.TV.